I'm Gavin Clark with the National Museum of Computing and Reading Museum, and we are interviewing former employees and customers of Digital Equipment Corporation as part of the 60th anniversary of DEC opening its first office in the UK. It's July the 17th, 2024, and we are online. And I'm here today talking to Dave Grainger. Dave, please, if we could just start with the background information, please just give us your full name and your place in your year of birth.
Good day. How are you? Nice to have an opportunity to talk to you about Digital Equipment Corporation. My name is Dave Grainger. Um, I'm 81 years old now. I was born in 1942 during the war. My father actually was born in England, Blackheath up near Birmingham. I think it's considered Birmingham now. And he immigrated with his brother and sister and parents to Canada. So I was a Canadian when I was born. Interestingly, Canadians in the 1940s and even actually up until 1969, when I first joined Digital Equipment, were considered British subjects. So I had a lot of linkage to the old world, as we would say. My background in Canada was, you know, attending schools. I went to university, the Eastern Ontario University, where I got a double E degree in engineering, electrical engineering. I actually studied computer technology, and in 1961 and 62. Computers were a relatively new concept, and I found it very interesting. And shortly thereafter, I worked for IBM during the summer, just doing punch card stuff as a kind of an intern. And then upon graduation, I had several job opportunities. And one of them was interesting. It was to move to the United States and become a computer person. So I jumped on that opportunity. I was married at the time, and we moved to the Boston area. I worked for a short period of time for Honeywell Corporation, which had a computer division at that time. And I worked for them for 5 years. And then in 1969, I joined this very small company called Digital Equipment, or Digital, sometimes referred to as DEC. Found it pretty interesting because their concept was to make computers more accessible to individuals. And I found that quite interesting. And at the time, they were looking for service people. I was hired initially to be the resident engineer at Princeton University, which is in New Jersey, a very large institution. They had a lot of technology there at the time, but they were very excited about the concept of mini computers. And and so that became really my beginnings at Digital.
Okay, so if you go back, there was quite a lot to cover there. So first of all, just tell me, what were your interests at school, or subjects did you sort of particularly find interesting? Did you have a technology or engineering interest, or was it an art subject? What were you like growing up?
My background, when I was younger, I was always interested in fixing things. My dad was in the automotive business. During the war, he was a test pilot for aircraft, so I was enamored with planes. At one point, I thought, I want to be an aeronautical engineer. Uh, that didn't occur, but my interest was high in all things mechanical and electrical. And I used to do projects, when I was in grade school, for our open houses where we would, you know, make all kinds of electronic contraptions to interest the parents when they came to visit the school and things of that sort. Later, when I started the university, I mentioned one job I had in the summer. One of the more interesting jobs was installing public address systems in schools. Back in those days, they had the intercoms which were wired, and most schools didn't have intercom systems. So if the principal wanted to talk to the teacher or to the class, you had to have a speaker in the room and switches and so on. So my job was to actually string wire usually during the summertime or when schools weren't open on the weekends, and string wires and install intercom systems. So that was fun. That got me interested even more in electrical engineering. But frankly, the computer side of it, my project actually, my uh, my thesis was on lasers. Um, Lasers were actually invented in 1957, so there was you know, very little information available on them, and I had to really work hard on that, and people found it quite interesting to understand what lasers are about. Of course, today lasers are used, it's a household word. It's used in virtually everything. But in that time, they were primarily used for scientific research. And it was later that when I was offered the job to get into the computer industry, that I jumped at it, and that was in
So that was a job at
1964.
Honeywell, I take it. Was that correct?
Yeah, that was my first opportunity, was to work for Honeywell. They had
You're
a
not the first
division
person.
in the.
So I was
Mhm.
going to say you're not the first person who worked at Honeywell. What was your role there? What job did you apply for at Honeywell? What did you end up doing?
Um, Well, they were just building a service organization because they were fairly new in it. They were trying to compete against the likes of NCR and Burroughs and IBM, CDC, Computer Devices, CDC. Um, and my role was to be in the installation support as a resident engineer. So I was married at the time. When I graduated, I got married, and so when my wife and I moved to the United States, um, they asked me, "Where would you like to be located when you finish your training here in Boston?" And I thought to myself, "Well, I've never been lived in the United States before, so maybe how about California?" That was my first choice. And then my second choice was I like Boston. I'll stay here in Boston. And my third choice was upstate New York because I could literally drive across the border in an hour or two and be at my home in Canada. So the course concluded after about 4 months of training, and it was time for an assignment. And I was asked by the head of human resources, said, "Dave, you're married, right?" And I said, "Yes, I am." He says, "Good." He says, "I have a I have an opportunity for you, and you're going to have to relocate." And I said, "Well, where would I be going?" He said, "Well, it's not your first choice and it's not your second choice, but it's pretty close to your third choice." And I said, "Well, where?" And he said, "New Jersey." I said, "New Jersey, New Jersey is New Jersey's not close to upstate New York." And he said, "Well, you know." So that was my first job, and I went down to New Jersey and I became the resident engineer at McGraw Hill.
What does that
It
mean?
was a book publisher.
What is a resident engineer?
So a resident engineer was a person who oversaw the installation of computers and did this support work, the installation, the service, the maintenance, and so on. And there were going to be a couple other people that I'd be working with, but they had designated me probably because I was married. Maybe they considered me, even though I was only 21 years old, a little bit more stable. Probably a more of a at home kind of guy. And so they put me on call. And so I was subject to being called up at any time, 7 days a week. They had a small, but a very small stipend for making yourself available. And you had to be able to get to the site at McGraw-Hill in New Jersey. You had to be able to get there within 2 hours. So that was my first job, and I was, you know, did that for a year or so, and then they promoted me to manager. By that time, we had hired more people, and they asked me to manage the part of the New Jersey service operation. And so then I moved from sort of a support role like that into a more of a management role, with being a backup engineer as well.
And you said you
And I
became
did
also
that
res.
job for
So,
5 years.
sorry, I was sorry.
Sorry.
I was going to say you also became, was it resident engineer? Was it at Princeton University? Was that later at DEC, or was that?
Yeah, well, what happened then after 4 or 5 years of this, uh, things were growing, business was going okay, but I was getting, frankly, a little bored. I didn't find I was having the challenge that I was looking forward to, and I couldn't see myself spending another 5 years. And I thought there was just more opportunity. I had heard about this company called Digital Equipment. I, would
Mm.
study the trade publications and whatnot, and listen to people in the business. And there was a lot of talk about this small company called Digital Equipment. They'd come up with the concept of a mini computer, which was almost like a personal computer in that only one or two people could work it at a time. But it was very specific. It was focused primarily in scientific research and educational applications. And because it was such a new idea,
Mm.
and that was the logical place. So I got interested in that. I went in and I talked to the head of service for, which happened to be nearby, not too far from where I lived, in Princeton, New Jersey. And he said, Dave, we'd like to hire you as a resident engineer for Princeton University. And they have 7 of our computers, and they're adding a lot more. And so that was my start, January 1969. They
So,
needed me to go to an additional training program to learn about their computers, but they didn't have an opening for that until February. So they said, for the first month, why don't I just go and we'll take you over to Princeton University, we'll introduce you, and you'll get to know your way around.
tell me how
And so they
important
did that.
tell me how important was the role of a resident engineer, because this is a time when computers were fairly new and IT departments didn't really exist, did they? So what kind of, how important was the role they'd given you as a resident engineer? What kind of, you said you've been installing, et cetera, but was the customer really dependent? In what way was the customer really dependent on you?
Yeah, there was a lot of customer interaction, and it was at the user level, not just at the management level. Now, the computers that they had at Princeton University were primarily in um, a research facility where they did nuclear research, and they were trying to basically take pictures in spark chambers, they're called physics applications, take pictures of atoms colliding with electrons. And they had a thing called an accelerator. There were only a few in the world at that time. There was one in Chicago, one in Princeton. There was one in Switzerland at CERN. Um, Probably less than a dozen of these cyclotrons. And so you had research engineers and scientists there. And my job was to meet with them and interact with them and support them, as well as the equipment, because they were always trying different things. They were always trying to move the technology around, adding new computers, doing different things. So there was a lot of interaction. Also, an interesting point to note. I don't know if this has come up in other discussions with your interviewers, but digital sales force were all engineers at the time. Um, we had products in the laboratory, as I said, in the physics departments, in engineering facilities, the engineering facilities of large industrial companies, but they weren't business computers. They were scientific for primarily for research at that time and for instrumentation and laboratory use. So the salespeople had to be able to interact, as well as the service people, with the client on uh, a common language, and and so that was one of the main roles of the resident engineer, to be able to communicate. Obviously, the primary job was to install and support and maintain the equipment if there should be any problems. But the interaction with the client was key. So I developed really some skills, I think, at that time. I found that very interesting, very exciting. I love going around to the various departments and doing that sort of thing. So the month that I joined Digital, it was interesting. Manager took me in and introduced me to the management at Princeton, but also some of the head scientists. And one of them said to me, "Oh," they said, "Dave, one of our computers is down. It's the PDP-1." The PDP-1 computer was the first computer Digital ever manufactured. It was called the Program Data Processor. That's PDP, and 1 indicated it was the first. So the PDP-1 apparently was down. Well, of course, I had no training on digital equipment products. And he said, "I'll show you where it is." And he took me into this room, and the PDP-1 was a fairly large computer. I mean, it probably stood 6 foot tall. It had 4 or 5 bays of equipment, so, you know, it was maybe 10 foot wide and maybe 12 foot wide. And he said to me, "Here it is." And I said, "Well, what's the problem?" He says, "Well, it won't interact with the disk drive." And I said, "Oh, okay, let me take a look." And I said, "Where's the disk drive?" He said, "Well, you just laid your code on it." I didn't recognize the disk drive. That was a bit embarrassing. But that was my first experience. Needless to say, within 30 minutes, as I stood and looked at the equipment and then pulled some prints out of the cabinet, I was able to easily discern, because of the way the lights were operating, that it was a simple problem, and it was a printed circuit board probably inside the cabinet. And long story short, um, I was able to open the cabinet, figure out which board was probably the one in the register, you know, it was the fourth or the fifth bit, and pull that board, turn the power off, pull the board out, put a new board in that I found in the cabinet, turned it back on, and the light was no longer on, although the lights were clear. And I thought, oh, looks like it's working. So I went and I got the customer and I said, "Do you want to give it a try now?" And I had no idea how to actually run the program on it. So I let the customer do it. I said, "You know, I think I want you to be the first to try out my first maintenance call," and it operated. And the rest is history.
Well
I
done.
spent a year at Princeton University and doing that role, and we added a lot of equipment. It became one of our large customers in the United States, and and then I was drawn to another management role. Really, I'd been a manager at Honeywell for a short period of time, but now they asked me if would I go to the southeast of the United States and take on a management role there.
Mhm.
And I went down to Atlanta and took on the southeastern United States for services and did a lot of hiring, a lot of recruiting.
Tell me,
That was in the mhm.
so I was just going to ask you. So it was interesting. You just go two points to circle back on. One was this concept of, you said before you applied to DEC, there was a lot of interest. You know, this whole concept of the mini computer was emerging, and DEC was getting a name for itself in the press that you were reading about. So if you could just tell
Right.
me what you were reading and what impressions you were forming of the company.
The I didn't hear a lot about uh, the company management or the people because it was such a small company. There weren't a lot of people in the field. Um, when I was first introduced to the person that ultimately hired me, a personal friend of mine still to this day, his name was Ken Sr. Ken had worked for Honeywell as well.
Hmm.
So we had an instant bond. Um, as you said, there were a lot of people that came from the Honeywell company. John Barrett was a good example in Scotland. John Barrett became head of services in the UK and a good friend of mine as well. But what I found was how personable the people were. They were interested in, the technology, and, we all were, but they were really interested in the people. I found that very satisfying. It wasn't a big, like, Fortune 10 company, like Honeywell was a huge company. They were much more personable. And that was one of the things that attracted me was my interview with Ken Sr. and meeting a few of the people that he had me interview with. You know, they used to joke about this. It's, now I'm recalling at the time and really through much of my career at Digital, we interviewed people to death.
Hmm.
We probably had a minimum of 5 to 10 people interview you before you got hired. I think in retrospect, it actually motivated the person being interviewed because they saw how interesting the people were, how diversified they were, and it made the company a lot more attractive.
Why was the hiring process?
Um,
Why did it involve so many people?
well, Ken interviewed me. Then he had 2 supervisors that interviewed me. Then he wanted me to meet the former resident engineer at Princeton, who got promoted to a management job in New York City. Um, then there was a human resource manager. The good news is we only had one human resource manager, so they weren't all over us. So I had one human resource manager interview and probably 3 line managers, and of course the person that was going to hire me. So I went through at least 5 interviews.
Was there a
Um,
particular?
but
I get some of those interviews are important, like HR, etc. But was there a kind of a philosophy behind why you had to meet so many people beyond the obvious, line managers or sign-offs?
yeah, it wasn't because I wasn't going to work for any of those people other than Ken himself. So really, the only person that ultimately I had to really satisfy was Ken. I think the philosophy was we wanted to know the people we were hiring, and we wanted them to. It wasn't really a test so much as it was why do you want to work for this company? What are your interests? Where do you see yourself in 5 years? Things of that sort. There wasn't a lot of technical evaluation. That usually came out because at that time Digital was hiring primarily people who had some experience in computers. We couldn't afford to start with a trainee that had no computer knowledge. We were just too small. I mean, the Princeton office that covered all of New Jersey and New York City and so on probably only had 8 people. And we had a lot of installations. When I went to Atlanta to cover the Southeast, I had one person in South Carolina, 2 people in Alabama, 2 people in Florida, and 3 people in Atlanta. Um, Probably when I left Digital in 1992, there were at least 1,000 service people. So the growth became phenomenal. But I think the idea was to be sure that you were hiring people that uh, you really wanted to make this their future, that really looked like they could grow with the company. If a person couldn't grow with the company, they would be like I felt. when I was at my previous company, that there was no place further to go. It was just a big thing. So to me, opportunity was everything. I was young, I was aggressive, but I loved what I was doing, but I wanted to have an opportunity to grow. And 25 years later, with 30,000 employees, I felt a personal sense of accomplishment.
What was the interview with Ken like? I mean, I've interviewed Ken, and what do you remember about Ken? Because obviously he was one of the early significant characters in Deck's story, isn't he?
He was. Ken Sr. actually was the first service manager in the UK. I don't know if you've come across that, but he was Ken's a very personable individual. As I said, his background was in services. Um, he had already accomplished in the 4 years I think he had been with the company at that time. I think he joined Digital in about 1964, 65. Um, Very family oriented. He was interested in my family. Um, he was interested in where I wanted to go and what I wanted to do, that sort of thing. And we just kind of hit it off. But Ken actually years later, became. He was always a mentor to me, and even still to this day. Although we ended up side by side in roles later in life. He was I always looked at him as a bit of a mentor, and that's probably why I joined Digital. The individual that hired me had a big impact on me. As far as Digital, I was very excited about the concept of, computer industry was new, but the idea of making computers more accessible to the individual to me was enthralling. Just think of it. We knew at that time the first computer ever designed was called the Whirlwind. It was developed uh, during the war to solve problems, and I think they had a Whirlwind probably at I don't know if they had a Whirlwind over where they did the Enigma, but um, these things needed air conditioning systems to cool them. They were huge. They would you could take up an aisle of a supermarket. You could just long bays of boxes. It seemed very impersonal. You would put your you would have punch cards that you would do on like a typewriter, and it would punch a card, and you would write your program on these punch cards, and then you would give the batch of punch cards to the computer operator, and their only job was to load your programs. Well, you would give them to them, and they would have batches and batches of them, and you would go away. 2 days later or 3 days later, they would call you and say, your program ran or it didn't run, and here are the results. So you had to wait like 2 or 3 days to find out if your program had a defect in it. And then you had to correct it and do it. And this process would go on and on. Here was a computer that you actually could sit at and write the program and see the results and interact with it like a personal computer today. It was the same concept. It was a mini computer. It was a box. Ultimately, it was no bigger than a desktop. Um, the first ones were a little larger than that, half cabinets. But they didn't throw off a lot of heat. They didn't require a lot of maintenance activity. Um, and I just thought this has got to be the future. Of course, we didn't know we were going to have personal computers, but that was the concept. That machine ultimately also had another capability where you could plug in additional typewriters, teletypes they were at the time, and then ultimately as today we would know them as like a terminal, an ASCII-like terminal. And you could use the same computer and share that computer. So you could put one person on it, you could put two people on it, you could put maybe up to four people. Eventually, computers were designed as we know today in the cloud, and you can access any of them using the internet through a communications line or device. And if you think about that, how far we've come from that, but the concepts were there, the concepts were laid out, and digital was a leader in the concepts of distributed computing. And that's what the mini computer allowed us to do. That's what time sharing allowed us to do. And then ultimately the network, which is the Ethernet as we know it today, and it was called DECnet at the time. Digital was a founder, along with Intel, of Ethernet. A lot of people don't know that. Xerox Digital and to create this whole notion of distributed computing. It wasn't a new concept, but of course technology advanced such that we do a lot more.
Mhm. So, Dave, tell me
So
about how you got to. So, you transitioned to the UK at some point, don't you? How did this happen?
yes, so in I was down in Atlanta. I was handling the Southeast United States. I was building the service organization there. We were doing a lot of hiring, uh, and one of the reasons that the service organization was absolutely critical to digital was a very simple fact that when we were small, we needed to have people interact with our customers, so we had to hire service people. Yes, salespeople, but we really needed service people. In many cases, the service people were like salespeople. In fact, I had many situations where the customer said, the reason I'm going to buy my next computer is because of my service person. They take care of me, they understand what I'm trying to do, and we interact well. I see them, you know, the service organization and the individuals, the technicians and the resident engineers have more interaction than any other person in the company. 4 or 5 times as much interaction than a salesperson. And so it was critical. The second reason was we were growing so fast. I wanted to mention that when I joined Digital in 1969, it wasn't quite $100 million company. Think of that as about 120 million pounds. Um, we weren't a super large company, and I was taking a risk going from a big company to going to a smaller one. But that was a risk I was willing to take for the opportunity. By the time I left Digital in 1992, and that's about 23 years, we had grown 150 times that. We were a $12 billion company. We were the second largest computer company in the world, only behind IBM. We were larger than HP. So the reason I say that is that when I was in Atlanta, I had a call from Ken Sr. Ken said, Dave, there's an individual that I want you to meet. He's flying from the UK. His name is Dave Lawrence. And he's going to come over and he wants to meet you in Atlanta. Here we go, 5 more interviews. But actually it wasn't. It was, in this particular case, I guess my reputation preceded me. And so Dave Lawrence came down, Ken Sr. came down. I think another person came down, personnel guy probably came down. And I had an opportunity to meet with Dave Lawrence. And Dave said, look, he said, we're growing very fast in the UK, but we have a very small service organization, and we really need to bring in some leadership, some people who have experience at hiring people, knowing the digital way, which of course I was then indoctrinated into, and doing the right thing, as we say. And Dave said, I need some help. Would you be willing to move to the UK and work? It wouldn't be forever, but come over for a period of time. And so I discussed it with my wife, and I said, here was another big risk, moving abroad. But I was already accustomed to moving. And I said, hey, we made the decision. And he said, okay, you're going to the north of what's called the north of the UK. I'd like you to be the manager there. We have a supervisor in Scotland. His name is John Barrett. We have two supervisors in Manchester, and Manchester would be your home. Colin McCain, Kirk McCoy, Brian Prince. I know them well. In case of two of them, God rest their soul, but they were great supervisors. And we moved. I moved over, and my family moved over as soon as school was out in the summer. So that was my introduction to Dave Lawrence and to the UK.
Was your role
The
to set up
UK
the service
operation.
operation to create? Were you there? Were you brought in to set up the UK service operation? Or what role did they have in mind for you?
So they wanted me to. I think I had probably at that time maybe 20 engineers in the north of the UK. Some in Scotland, some were resident engineers. Edinburgh University maybe had an engineer. I don't know if Glasgow did or not. Yorkshire, we had an engineer, Peter Waldron, in York. He worked out of his home. We all kind of worked out of our homes except where we would have a branch office. So I was in a branch office. I didn't have to work out of my home. But the engineers kind of worked out of their homes, or they were assigned as resident engineers to different sites. And so that organization was, yeah, I'd say maybe 20. I can't recall exactly, but I'd say maybe 20 to 30 employees in total, including probably 5 salespeople, a couple of administrators, and I think they told me I had 20 open job positions. So I had to double the organization. You imagine the immense challenge that. And, if you didn't have some experience at recruiting or knowing how to go about that process, it would be difficult. And we just didn't have the bandwidth. John was the new supervisor. I mean, these supervisors were excellent. They knew the equipment. They knew the customers. They cared. They worked hard as heck. And they were, fun to be around. And we just took off.
So your role was
So
to
that
expand
role,
your role was to expand services in the north of England or across the whole of the UK.
yeah, in the north of England, but I only did that for a year because the following year, only 12 months later, Dave Lawrence calls me. He says, "Dave, I got to share something with you. Could you come down to Reading and we'll talk?" And so I came down. He said, I'm going to be. We're building a plant in Ayr, Scotland, and they've asked me to be the plant manager. But what a perfect person to open a new plant in the UK, Dave Lawrence, who had all of this knowledge of the technology, all of the knowledge of the people and the customers, to go open a plant to hire a lot of people in Scotland to start our first plant in the UK. So I said, gee, congratulations, so on. So why did you want to see me? He says, well, I would like you to come down here and replace me. It was him and Ken Sr., who was head of services now in Geneva, who probably Ken had the input, but obviously Dave Lawrence kind of made the recommendation, asked Dave to come down. So I was quite proud of that, pleased with that. And Dave and I had a great relationship. And so we made the decision. What was more interesting was, this is a little side note, was who could replace me in Manchester. So I called up John Barrett. I knew that he was the person to come to handle the North of the UK, and he already had Scotland. So I said, John, I said, I'm going to be going to Reading. Dave Lawrence is going up there and so on. And he said, oh, well, congratulations. I said, so I'm going on vacation here with my family, finally getting a break for 2 weeks. And we're going to Spain, but we're going to drive. So I had this problem. I need to replace myself, and I wanted you to come down, to Manchester and take on this role. He said, "Oh, I'll have to talk to Marjorie about that. I'm not sure. And we don't like to move. We like to stay here in Scotland." I said, "John," I said, "the phone is breaking up. I can't hear you. I'll tell you what. I'll call you in a couple of days. You give it a thought." I went on vacation. I didn't really have any communications with him. I did have someone send him a note. I told him that I was kind of stuck and couldn't communicate well, but I told him that I would see him in Manchester. And when I got back from vacation, he was in my office, sitting in my office. He and Marjorie. And Marjorie says to this day, because she didn't want to move, it was the biggest decision they ever made, and it was a very important one and a happy one. And to this day, and I know Marjorie, his wife, very well. So that's the way it was. We had opportunity. We took a lot of risk. We knew our stuff, but we had fun too.
Well, it sounds like it, and it sounds like DEC was willing to move you around. I mean, there was communication and there was willingness to move people like yourself and Ken Senior internationally. Did they take care of your relocation for you? To what extent were you kind of
They
catered
did.
for or
They
lifted
did. Of
over?
course. Yeah. Of course. Yeah. Of course. I mean, I made my first job with Honeywell. I think I was making $5,000 a year. Imagine that, $5,000 a year. I mean, what's that? 4,000 pounds. Um, I remember Wendy Mather, who was the human resource manager at the time before before Peter Thompson came to digital. Wendy called me up in Manchester and she said, "David, I heard you hired another secretary." And I said, "Yes, I got that. But I heard you paid her whatever it was, 3,000 pounds. You can't do that. She'll be the highest paid secretary in uh, in the UK." I don't know if you want to include that clip, but
Why did you pay her
I
so
said, "Hey,
much?
I said, you know what? She's going to be worth it." And she was. She was the secretary in Manchester. She was still the secretary in Manchester when I was running worldwide services. So back in Maynard, Massachusetts. So she must have spent 20 years with us. First name was Sue. I can't think of her last name.
So,
Um,
so tell me, so
but Sue,
why do you think DEC was? I'll come back to this interesting story, but tell me, just finish up your end. Why was, I guess, why was DEC willing to move you all around internationally? I mean, you coming from the States, then obviously I get the people moving
right?
within country, but they went to the expense and the effort to bring you over as well. Why
Yeah,
was there this willingness to do that?
yeah. Well, it wasn't. To me, it wasn't really for the money. I obviously I had I owned my home in Atlanta, and when they moved me, they had an assistance program where they would use a relocation company that would buy your house at whatever the market value was. So that took one burden off. They made it easy that way. They paid for relocation expenses, which would be the cost of moving, taking the family over, and and then once I got to the UK, um, they were there was an initial period where they would pay to help me set up the place. It wasn't a lot of money, but it was enough. You weren't out of pocket per se. So that wasn't a negative. I mean, they were smart about that. Companies at that time, I mean, the whole world was growing like crazy. So large companies, if they wanted to be succeed, they had to have the ability to move people around and have relocation policies that made sense, particularly for management or for unique individuals, scientists, engineers, and whatnot. And so that was commonplace then. It's commonplace today. Um, but the idea was to cover your costs. Now, you asked an important question. I moved, John moved, lots of people, Ken Sr. moved, a lot of people moved. Was that the norm? Not really. There were probably 20, 30% of the people that had relocations within digital over a period of time. Um, Back in those days, back in the 50s and 60s, you have to remember that people were used to being relocated because this coming out of the armed services, we used to hire a lot of technicians from the military. That was a source of service employees for us. They had experience in radar and radios and electronics and so on. And if you're in the military, they move you, they move you, your postings are all over. So this experience of moving service people was not unusual. I would say service probably had the most mobile workforce in the company, for sure. Obviously, sales had some, but not nearly as much. Uh, but service people, they just moved us all over. So when when I left digital, there were 30,000 service employees worldwide, probably 3,000 in the UK. That's a huge number. Here I was in the North UK with 20 or 30 maybe employees. Um, and we had 3,000 by the time I left. I left the company in 1992. It was a big operation.
So tell me a little bit before we move on. Just tell me, um, it's interesting to hear your perspectives having come to the UK. What briefly in a few words, what was Manchester like when you arrived there? Culture shock. What was the town like, and was it a bit of a culture shock coming from Atlanta?
Yeah, it was. Uh, to me, it was interesting. When I was in university, uh, the first year between my first and second year in university, I had an opportunity to do what's called Canadian University Student NIFCUS, National Federation of Canadian University Students, and they said we have opportunities for you to go to Holland. So for $300, we can get you a plane ticket, and Holland, the government in Amsterdam in Holland has job opportunities for you, and you can work for them, and you can travel or do whatever you want. So I had this international experience. Here I was 17, 18 years old, and I had the opportunity to go to a foreign country and learn a little bit about the culture. And I did that. I worked at Amstel breweries, uh, which was an interesting job, just a laborer job, and Van Houten, the chocolate company up in Wees, Poland, and that was an interesting job, midnight shift. And after the end of that summer, I had 3 weeks left, so I'd saved up some money from these jobs, and then I bought a haversack and I started hitchhiking around Europe. And I went down through Germany, down the Rhine to Switzerland, over to France, up to Paris, and ultimately back across um, the Channel. And that was a ferry ride back then. They didn't have the channel then,
Mm.
but um, that experience at that age probably made me a little more confident in my ability to do, you know, do different things and travel around. And the experience, probably along with my engineering and so on, my interest in computers, that's probably what drew me to the service industry.
So what was Manchester like?
Because I knew that's
Were you kind of used? Were you?
Manchester was a Man, Manchester, a very industrial city. I lived up in Chorley, which is just north of Manchester. I'm trying to think of where our first office was, and I can't think of the name of it right now. But it was in the north part of Manchester, and then we moved into a larger building as we kept growing like crazy in Manchester. Bob Thorley was the sales manager, so and he ended up managing the North UK sales operation. Kind of lost track of Bob, but he and I worked together, and we were kind of a team. He handled sales, and I handled all the service and activities of that sort. And Manchester itself was the home of the BAC 111s, I think they call them. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about. A BAC 111 was British Aircraft Corporation's 111 aircraft. It was a jet, two-engine jet, and it flew out of Manchester. Its home base was Manchester. I used to go down to Reading or down to London on that plane. Uh, they had a lot of manufacturing companies. Pilkington Glass Company was a big employer just outside of Manchester. Um, but it was a central location, considered the central spot in the north of England. So it was kind of an ideal place to pick up all the surrounding towns and counties, uh, and Liverpool and places like that. Um, but it was very industrialized. The big thing I was introduced to, you asked me what was the culture like. I finally learned what football was because the digital service guys were really rough and tumble group, and so we had our own little league of players that we would get together and play other teams, um, on Saturday or Sunday. And I remember some of those experiences. I didn't know what I was doing, but I was learning the game. Culture-wise, the language, two things. No, two things: driving and the language. That was both were a bit of a shock. I had to learn to drive on the other side of the road, which for a person that's already driving is actually easier than you think. You don't believe you're going to be able to do it, but the mind is an amazing device that it somehow tells you what to do. Every now and then you would make a slip up and say, "Oh my gosh," you end up on a one way, going the wrong way on a 4-lane street, but not often. You couldn't allow that to happen. Anyway, they said to me in the office, they said, "Dave, you after 6 months you have to get your own UK for driver's license. That's the law." Oh my goodness, I'm going to have to take a test. I said, "Well, that's okay. I can drive." And they said, "Well, why don't you take a lesson with this company that you can hire a company that will teach you how to drive on the right side of the road." I said, "I don't need that. I've been driving for what, 10 years now. I know how to drive." And they said, "Well, for instance, what's a left turn signal?" And I said, "This." And they said, "You just put your eyes in the teacher's face, or you just put your hand in the teacher's face." And I had to laugh. That's right. I'm going to be sitting on the other side of the seat. Um, so you had to be able to do the hand signals. You had to be able to double park. It was a much more aggressive test than I had when I got my license in Canada. Um, and it all worked out well. I never had an accident that I recall of while I was in the UK or driving on the other side of the road. Um, Second thing was the language. That was a culture shock. I didn't realize there were so many dialects. I learned a lot. I could tell by the time I left England 3 years later, I knew the part of the area of the country that you came from. I could tell a person with a York accent, a person with a Scottish accent, a person with a Manchester accent, a person with a London, Reading, whatever accent, so the southeast. So the language was a challenge, and you had to listen very closely to understand exactly what was being said. But one of the benefits is I learned how to determine where you're from. And even to this day, I can still tell to a large extent. My youngest son, when we moved to Manchester, was 3 years old. So he was talking, but he was just beginning to socialize with other kids. When we left England, he had an English accent, and he was made fun of at the schools when we eventually moved back to the United States. He was made fun of by his friends because of his English accent. Where are you from, you English kid?
Well,
So those
that's
were
it.
two culture things. The food, of
Hmm.
course, uh, different food. I
What,
like
what
English food.
and what was Reading like? So you've gone to Reading, because you're only in the UK for 3 years, quite an intense period of
Yeah, I
time.
was I was a year in Manchester and 2 years down in Reading. And when I came down to Reading at Dave's request and Ken Senior's, um, we were in the Butt Center. We had just moved, I think, from Arkwright Road. Well, we had an operation in Arkwright Road, not a big operation, but probably a warehouse and some other things, and and then some staff there. But then we moved into the Butt Center, which I don't know if the Butt Center is still standing. I think it is, but I'm not sure. Uh, are you aware?
I'm not aware.
There is.
No, I'm not aware. But I don't know Reading too
No.
well. But
The
so what?
Butt Center is down St. Mary's Butts, down in
Mhm.
St. Mary's Street, or Butt Center, very close to where our very first office was, in a corner shop on the street. Um, our first office for digital, but then later Arkwright Road, and then after that the Butt Center,
What
and
was
then
the office?
after that Digital Park.
What was the office like? Can you describe it? The inside?
It was a I mean, physically it was a 6-story, or at least 6-story office building, very modern, underground parking. I remember they did the parking. Getting in and out of the parking garage was a major fiasco, major disaster, because they used an English or an American design for the building, and because you drive on the other side of the road, they had a lot of problems getting cars in and out of the car park ramps. You had to go down, you know, the ramps to get to the subterranean basement levels to park your car. So it was a modern office, but it had a shopping plaza on the first floor and some shops. And then the other floors were all offices. And we had the top 2 stories of that building. So we had about a third of the building. Um, that that office then became, we grew a lot. That's where Jeff Shingles and Dave were located. Wendy Mather for human resources, myself, when Dave moved on, and so we had 2 floors there. I think service took up one floor, and sales administration took up the other floor.
And was it? You said it was a modern building. Was there much
Yeah, it
networking
was a
going on
modern.
in the building? You get to meet lots of people. Was it everyone kind of out most of the time?
Uh, just the people that you work with primarily. You walk around I did a lot of traveling, so my socialization at that time was with the with digital people, tech people, and although I had some interesting experiences, I met a lot of people. One interesting thing that happened is um, I was also responsible for Northern Ireland for services. We big customer was the Belfast Telegraph, and at that time in the 1972 1974 time frame, there was literally a civil war going on in Northern Ireland, and it was seeping into even into the London area, bombings and whatnot. So it was very hard to support our customers there. But Belfast Telegraph was a big customer, and it being the media company they were, they had to get the newspapers out. So I needed to hire an engineer, and I was always sending engineers from the North UK, from Scotland primarily. For some reason, the Scottish and the Northern Ireland people got along. And I would say to John, I said, John, we uh, we really need you to send somebody over there to take care of the telegraph. So what happened was during this time of crisis in the UK with the Northern Ireland problem, I had to hire some people. I knew I had to hire people, and we went. We advertised in the newspapers. I got interviews lined up, and then I think I took John Barrett. Yeah, I took John Barrett and I went over. John came over from Manchester because I was going to assign Northern Ireland to the North UK to John Barrett. So we had to hire an engineer, and we actually hired the first Irish employee was Jerry Tierney. Jerry Tierney, great guy. He said we interviewed several people. A couple of them didn't show up. I think probably Jerry was the best of three or four people we got to choose from. But I like Jerry, and Jerry said, "But I only have one problem." He said, "I don't have a car. If I get a car, the insurance is crazy because cars are being stolen." And so I said, "Jerry, we'll find a way to solve that problem if you'll take this job." So I went back to home office, and I got on the phone with the United States, and I said, "I know that you've been talking about a company car policy for field service people, but I really need a car for our first employee in Ireland because this is a problem." That's when the company car policy for field service began worldwide, actually for the company. That first hire in Northern Ireland. Um, Jerry called me about 2 months later, and he said, "Dave, I've got good news and bad news." I said, "Well, give me the good news." He said, "I'm alive." I said, "What's the bad news?" He said, "Somebody came to our house last night, stuck a gun in my mother's face, and demanded the keys for the car. The car has disappeared." I said, "Well, okay, get a rental car for now and let's find out what's going on." He called me the end of the week and said they found the car. His oscilloscope, which was worth thousands of dollars, which was one of the test instruments the engineers needed at that time, and his tool case and some of his spare parts were still in the boot. But the car had been used in an armed robbery. And they hadn't bothered to open the boot, I guess, and they'd used an armed robbery and just left it someplace. So that was our experience in Northern Ireland.
Tell me, that's an incredible story. Tell me a little bit about, I suppose, because you're in Reading and you're getting this very intense, very active era in British history, that period. What's
Yeah,
the, I suppose I'm getting a good feel for the workplace culture here. There's a lot of knowledge, you all kind of know each other.
yeah,
There's a lot of working
yeah,
together. We hear a lot about this concept of the deck way, don't we? Just describe what's your take on the deck way, and was it ever sort of handed down to you as a piece of paper, or is it something more that was kind of a feeling that you guys had?
Well, I'll switch from service and talk about sales for a moment. Here's the interesting thing. And I actually ran not only worldwide services, but at one point I had the U.S. sales organization, the United States sales organization. Our salespeople, until I left the company, were never on commission, any place in the world. No commission. Have you ever heard of a sales force that isn't on commissions? It came from the culture. Our first employees in sales were engineers, as I said. They had to be able to relate to the client. They had to know the technology. They had to know what these laboratory instruments were all about, and so on. And so we hired people with that experience as engineers. And the idea was to pay them as engineers and pay them for what they could accomplish, not for how much they sold, because the main objective was to always take care of the customer first. That culture in sales emanated, throughout the organization, but it came from the top. It came from Ken himself, Ken Olson, the founder of the company. You know, always take care of the customer. If you take care of the customer, they'll come back again and again and again. Later, I can say, and the company, as I said, how successful it was, the second largest computer company when I left. A lot of people say, why did digital fail? Why is digital no longer? Why was it acquired by Compaq and HP? All they say it's because they didn't pay their sales force commission. As soon as they hired the sales force, as soon as they took those companies on, they started paying the salespeople commission. That did not make the company more successful. You had to, first of all, you had to pay your people well, which we did. You had to recognize individuals, teams, teamwork. So you always did it in teams. There was no such thing as, recognize the salesperson for an account without acknowledging the service people that supported him. You just did that. So in the early 80s, I had already returned to the United States, but this plays into the culture thing. We cared so much about the customer experience that we started doing customer surveys. Nobody did customer surveys in the 1980s. You never asked your customer how happy, how satisfied they were, what disappointed them, and so on. We did these surveys and we measured our offices and our people on them, primarily the office, because it was a team. And because they were anonymous surveys. And we would tell the customer, you can remove your name from the survey if you want. You don't have to mention anyone, but just tell us how satisfied you are in these different. But it was always around the locale. So the Manchester office, the Edinburgh office, the Reading office, they all had customers that were surveyed to find out how satisfied they were. And those are the top 10, we call it the top 10 in the world, were recognized in the celebration once a year. We would hold a top 10 award ceremony, and we would invite people. This was true in sales. They called it decathlon in the case of play off the name DEC. So decathlon, they had one for Europe and they had one for the US. So the top salespeople, and then for the service, service had the same thing, only we had for the top 10 offices in Europe. And we would take them for a week or a weekend. Somebody else would cover their office for them, and we would take them someplace. So, we might take them to Switzerland, or we might take them to someplace in France, down in the Caen area, someplace like that. and we would spend several days, you know, letting them unwind. Their family, their wives were always, their spouse or significant other was always invited. And so that was a recognition program. Throwing money at people didn't, in our minds, motivate people. Recognizing them, rewarding them, awarding them, and praising them, both, as management, but also I think even from the customers, uh, was the big dividend.
Was there ever a tension, this kind of concept of do the right thing by the customer? Was there ever a tension doing right thing by the customer might mean deck is left out of pocket for some way, by providing free services or support? Did that ever crop up, or was there ever a conflict in this concept?
Oh yeah. Well, a good example would be, um, I won't name who the customer was or but I can recall if a customer called me and was very dissatisfied and had a legitimate claim, I would often say, apologize, say, resolve the problem, which we would, and tell them they're not going to pay for the service for the rest of the year. I would give it away. And that, uh, people, when the first time I did that, people thought I was crazy. Why are you doing that? I'm doing it because the customer is, the customer's, the customer's right, and the customer needs to be taken care of. And by the way, that's a penalty against your office and your management for not having taken care of this customer, not listening to them because they gave you a chance and you didn't take care of it properly. So guess what? I'm taking care of it properly. And oh no, I did that. That was my punish and reward system, I guess. There was a little punishment. Now that was important because I wanted to mention one other thing that I think is service was really crucial. And when I was in the UK, a lot of this stuff started in the UK, but service was not a cost of doing business. It was a way of doing business in my mind. What do I mean by that? We all know today that computing services really is a subscription based thing. It's an annuity. We don't pay thousands of dollars for something, we pay by the month. That's the way we looked at service at digital. Service was a moneymaker. It was the most profitable part of our company. 30% of our revenue came from services, and probably half of the profits of the company came from services. Now, what were those services? It wasn't just the break fix mentality or maintenance services. It was consulting services. It was resident engineers if clients needed that. It was in later years systems integration, where we brought together the technologies, interface, the software, the application, so on, and the hardware, sometimes mixed multi-vendor hardware, put it all together. Consulting. Um, those weren't businesses in the 70s and 80s. I mean, the consultant business was very small. There were probably in any country there was probably a small number of consulting firms. We always refer to the big five consulting firms, the Ernst and Youngs and Coopers and so on. But back in those days, and now today, back in those days, it didn't exist. And today, of course, we have system integrators in every town, every city, but they didn't exist. So and the reason we did that was to help our clients put together solutions. So we were in the services area, we were thinking early about things like that. Um, so it's a big part of our model was the revenue and the profit associated with it. And so I was measured on revenue and profit, but I was primarily measured on customer satisfaction. That was my number one measurement. And that was always at least half of my focus had to be on the satisfaction of the clients, and then the rest could be financial related things
Didn't
and human
customers?
resource things.
I believe customer surveys fed back into people's reviews, didn't they?
Yes, they did. They did. And we always highlighted the customer satisfaction reports. Ken Senior actually was the inventor of that customer satisfaction report. He called me one day and he said, I have this idea. I don't know if he was in Geneva at that time or if he was in the States, but he called me and he said, we're going to start something here called customer satisfaction surveys, and we're going to mail them out. And we're going to get the results in, and then we're going to recognize people, the top 10 offices. So he was a mentor in that regard, and it was a great concept. It never, as I said, it never been done in the industry before, not that I was ever heard of or ever aware of. And to recognize and to take a whole office and its staff and give them a 3 or 4 day weekends someplace. I mean, for just taking care of their customers. I mean, wow, very motivational. Oh, you wanted to be a winner of one of those. That
Tell,
was the goal. Everybody wanted to be a winner.
tell me about, we also discussed earlier, we touched on this idea of DEC having a fairly enlightened perspective. I guess the extension of do the right thing, but towards its employees. This idea of it seemed to try and advocate a more kind of diverse workforce and supporting people and career advancement. You mentioned some of the work you've done with the payment of the above average salary for Wendy, I think it was. Do you have any other examples of this attempt to I suppose advance as employees through initiatives to kind of doing the right thing by staff in this kind of like what we today might call progressive workplace culture?
Thinking back on the Wendy discussion, where I paid the secretary that I was hiring, which really she was more than a secretary. I mean, she was really the office administrator, but she was called a secretary because in the UK, that's what you call them. You didn't call them administrators. You couldn't. It was. That was a different time, a different place. I guess what I'm saying is that you got to understand, Dave. You got to follow the rules. You got to pay people. You can't pay people too much. I was breaking the rules. Here's this American coming in and saying, I'm going to pay. I just hired my office administrator, my secretary, and I paid her more than any other secretary because I wanted her. And I knew she was worth it. And I knew that's what she needed. And so, yeah, I broke the rule. I hope some of that rolled off me. Uh, but that was my approach to it. I don't know if it was I don't want to say it was an English or an UK thing, but um, the other thing is unions were very powerful, very strong uh, in Britain at the time. I'm not sure how powerful and strong they are today. I don't keep up with it, but we were not ever unionized as a company, ever. No one ever wanted to union. We had workers' councils in Germany because that was by law, but in the rest of the world, other than the UK, there may have been, other than Germany, there might have been some other countries in the Far East that had kind of worker council type things but we didn't feel we needed that. You take care of your people. There, there wasn't a lot of attrition. We were growing so fast, and the hiring process, as difficult as it was to get a job with digital, it was successful, and people just didn't leave. We had very, very low turnover. I mean, I can't imagine the turnover rate of digital. I'm sure back in that era in the UK was maybe 2%, and there was probably a good reason for that. So very, very different. So that was also, all these things were part of the culture.
Were
I
you
guess they
aware,
built on one another. Different.
were you aware of other people? You mentioned obviously giving Wendy this kind of extra salary bump. Were other managers kind of sort of breaking the rules or trying to advance staff that you were aware of in this or in similar kind of ways?
I think if the boss says it's okay, I guess we can do it. We can, do what's right. I guess really means do what's right. Um, I mean, it doesn't mean don't use your head or don't be crazy, but it literally meant do what's right. And I guess that's just an example of it. I mean, if I was measured in profit and loss, which I was, and customer satisfaction, I wouldn't want to pay someone an exorbitant amount and lose money. I mean, that wouldn't make any sense. How a business can't survive that way. There was a strong entrepreneurial instinct in digital. Um, Particularly, I would say, I want to comment on the service side here again. We were entrepreneurs. We're very creative. I mean, all these concepts that we came up with consulting and integration and network services and resident engineering, these were things we knew customers could benefit from, but we knew they were a means of generating more revenue and profit and also more resource to do a better job. So to me, that was very entrepreneurial. It wasn't me. It was the senior management of the company was just like that. They encouraged us to be entrepreneurial in spirit, to think out of the box, um, and we did. And I think that when I look back now and I read some of the digital, uh, the XDEC news and so on, uh, former employees, they often comment about the best company they ever worked for, the best job they ever had, the best manager they ever had. These accolades, I mean, it doesn't, it's not infrequent, it's frequent. It just, it's just the way it was. It was a wonderful time, wonderful era. And
So,
it's not the reason the company failed.
I was coming on
It's
to
not the
this.
reason the company, yeah,
Sorry to interrupt you, Dave. So, because I was coming on to this. So, you were in the UK for 3 years. You obviously go back to the States. Work takes you on, moves you on in life, and then you left in '92. Deck in '92.
yeah,
How were things by '92? There's a lot to skip over, but I think we've got a sense of where your career is going here. By the '90s,
yeah.
by '92, how's Deck looking? Is that kind of culture still in evidence, or is it starting to change? Do you feel it changing?
Yeah, the culture hadn't changed, but the leadership had changed. Um, I think that we suffered that we didn't have a succession plan for Ken and that Ken hung on too long. It's called founder's disease. Ken was a wonderful, creative entrepreneur, but I think that um, maybe an inappropriate comment, but I think that it got to be the point where we weren't changing the way we used to change fast enough, and it was a kind of a freezing of the mentality um, at the top. And I could see the writing on the wall by 92, 91, 92. At that time, I'd run worldwide services, I'd run the North American sales, uh, and I was, um, and so we were trying to mix things up and do things differently, and then we were just getting too many roadblocks. That was one problem, the management problem of doing new things. A lot of people will say it was the personal computer that came out. Bill Gates was a customer of ours. Bill Gates built Microsoft using a PDP-8. Uh, they were a big DEC user, and they used our computers to build their software. Ultimately, MS-DOS. They launched and Intel had the chip, and anyone could have done it. It turned out to be IBM because IBM is so dominant. When IBM put the name on it, the IBM PC, it just took off, and it changed the world, um, as we know. And we had an opportunity to respond to that in different ways, not with more PCs, but by moving from what we were good at into more distributed computing and emphasizing that rather than I agree that we shouldn't have tried to beat and compete against IBM with PCs. Um, IBM isn't in the PC business anymore.
Mm.
They've sold it. It's been sold to China. Lenovo has IBM's PCs now. So it didn't work out for IBM either, ultimately. But it took 20 years, for that, 20 plus years for that to happen. Um, Technology changed, just like mini computer changed the world, and distributed computing changed the world. PC changed the world. Digital had to change its technology with it. And I wanted us to be more of a consulting company, more of an integration company. I believe that's where, personally, and that's one of the reasons I moved on. I ended up actually leaving in '92 and went to Xerox and headed up worldwide services at Xerox Corporation. Um, and and my time with DEC was over, and it was before digital was sold, before Ken Olson resigned as a founder, and Bob Palmer took over. I was already gone from digital, and that the year before.
What did you think when you saw the, I suppose, two questions? You saw the Compaq acquisition, and you must have seen the HPE acquisition news. What were your thoughts? How did you feel about seeing that?
Um, we had an opportunity to actually buy Compaq. I don't know. That's not revelation. Not a revelation, I'm sure, for anyone that would be watching this video. Um, but we went down. A number of us went down together to talk and looked at buying Compaq, and we decided that we weren't a good, for some reason. Well, let's just say the consensus was it wasn't a good match. Later, they
Was
became
Compaq for sale?
successful enough to actually.
Sorry to interrupt. Would they put themselves
No, it
up for
wasn't for
sale, or
sale,
were
but
you just
we had so much cash, and we thought this might be a way of getting into the PC business without having to go there. We had a lot of cash at the time. We were profitable at the time. It was probably about 1987. We were probably no 89 probably. Yeah, because I was heading up sales at the time. Um, so there was an opportunity to maybe acquire Compaq, and it might have changed things. We never know. But the consensus wasn't there to do it, and so we didn't do it. And so later, when the company was drained of cash, we had a new CEO, we had different board of directors. Then, the idea was to put the company up for sale. And that's how the Compaq thing, but it didn't work out for Compaq. Very quickly, HP came along. I think the HP acquisition was a good thing, a very positive thing, because HP was a good company. Their founders were good people, Hewlett and Packard, and they, I think that's what the founders' name. They were out of San Jose, out of the West Coast anyway, California.
so? What were your thoughts on
They
seeing the
started in the.
acquisition? Were you kind of
Well, I
expecting it?
was
Sorry to see
by
it
that
go.
time. Oh no, I wasn't sorry to see it go because I knew that it had a life for the employees that were there, and that it would move on and it would be hopefully successful. I hope that they focus more on services because I felt that's where the future was moving. The box mentality. The HP has a very successful printer division, but they make all their money selling ink. We know that. The printer division, I don't even know if it may be separate from it. I think HP may have divided itself into two pieces now, but I think I don't really keep up with this stuff now. At my age, I can't keep track of it all. But I think that they have a components division today that was printers and that. I mean, they had a good printer. Digital had a great printer, but I think it was too late for HP to be able to use our technology. We had the DEC writer, which was a great printer for personal use. But anyway, but HP had good printing technology, so that's one thing side of the business. I didn't see the DEC acquisition adding anything to that. I saw the DEC acquisition as adding customers, um, some technology, and networking. And the consulting integration business. I think HP had its own consulting and HP integration business, and I'm not too sure.
Mm.
But I saw it as a good thing for the employees. I mean, okay, so the company's name has changed, and it's not digital anymore. It's Compaq HP. The pensions were, I think, taken care of, at least in the U.S. I'm not sure how it worked in the U.K., but I think it all worked okay. I hope it did.
And what are your thoughts? I suppose. Do you think it has two questions, final questions? Does DEC leave a legacy in the world, and what is it? And what's I suppose what's been its mark on you? How has it shaped you as you've grown and gone on to do other things?
Um, okay, let me answer your first question as best I can. I think the legacy of digital is really um, people won't remember the company. They don't remember the company even now. Here we are 20 years later. If you ask people do you know who Digital Equipment was, a lot of them don't. Only if you were a former employee or if you had a family member that was there would they know. But and so that's the sort of the sad side of it. The positive side of it is that the people that were digital went on, many of them on to do great and better things. Their experience, their learnings has greatly impacted the computer industry as we know it today. That's why in the computer museums of the world, digital will always have a prominent place for the early history of computing. Um, and again, so the people, many of the engineers, many of the smart folks went on to found other companies, startups. Um, so I think that's, to me, that's a legacy. It's like, you can walk through a cemetery and you wonder who are all these people, you want to know about their lives. But if you look into it, you find out that these people had an influence in our society today in some way, shape, or form. It's just a matter of looking for it, but it's there. It's embedded in who we are and what we've got today. So um, that's, I think, the legacy. As far as me personally, I had a great career. Um, I was 50 when I left, 49, I guess, when I left digital. I went on to work at Xerox and head their worldwide services. The goal there, which I don't feel I was successful at, was to move them from a light lens mentality to information technology. So they continued to survive on their printers and their copying business, and uh, and but the goal was to do some of that, and we did some. There were some spin-offs from some of the work I did there. Um, I mean, they say it takes 20 years to start an industry, 20 years to mature it, and 20 years for it to go away. And I think that's kind of what we're looking at. You can see that in my view with Xerox. You can see it with digital equipment. You can see it with IBM. Um, and all of these things evolved onto other things. Digital, to me, to my mind, though, was a unique place because of its people, its entrepreneurship, its creativity, not just its contribution to the information technology that we have today. The last thing I wanted to say was that I was quite proud to be involved with founding some of the new service technologies, such as remote diagnosis. Things today we take for granted. I used to call it the 20-second call, the two-minute call, and the 2-hour call. And what that involved was we created a database. We had a really good piece of database software, and we created a database system for customers that you could dial into called a bulletin board, because back in the 80s and 90s, all you had was dial-up modems. So you could dial into it on a terminal, into this database, and you could ask a question, and we'd give you the answer. All our database was built around problems clients were experiencing. Today, we know that that's embedded in all of our applications today. We think of that today when we're on our phones or on our PCs, and you want to ask a question. There's a question database. All of that technology and idea of making that started back then. That didn't exist before. Later, a little bit later, an outgrowth of that was a form of AI called rule-based software, rule-based technology, where we created a remote diagnostic center. And I don't know if that you've gotten into that in Reading at all, but we had 3 centers in the world, and you could dial into these. The computers could dial into these centers and be diagnosed remotely. We were the second computer company to do it. The first one was a very big supercomputer company called Cray International. They had a big super. Nobody else did that. We did that, popularized that, made it available to every customer that had a computer, a VAX computer, by simply adding a board. And then later, all our computers came with that board built into it, so that it would self-diagnose using that remote diagnostic center and people assisting. So I was pretty proud of that. That was, to me, was an accomplishment. And I know that lives on today. I see it in different forms, but I see it today. And in call centers. So anyway, there was a lot of pride there in working with that. And today I carry that forward. So my legacy today, I guess, is my family. I have 4 boys. I lost one, my oldest son, a few years ago, but all 4 boys are in technology today. Can you believe it? Unbelievable how successful they've been. And maybe a bit of it rolled off of me, I don't know. But I know they always ask me about it. One of them is a partner at a Francisco Partners, which is a big private equity firm, San Francisco. And he is the go-to sales guy. Whenever they buy a company, they send him in to straighten out the sales. Another of my sons runs a UK company, actually, but he runs it from his headquarters from his office in Charlotte. You're going to ask me what the name of it is, and I can't remember, but it's software, and it's the second software company that he's overseen. The third son is got his own technology company, which started in the year 2000. So shortly after I left Xerox, and before I went to do a turnaround company, a tablet computer company, I went to be CEO of. Before I did that, I worked with him and I watched him, and I thought, this is a very creative idea. And what he did was he came up with, I think it was called Real Videos back in the day, but it was before we had YouTube. In fact, YouTube may have come from that, but anyway, I think it was called Real Videos. And the guy that founded that company had an idea of streaming videos. Well, you had to have fast internet to do that. And we didn't have fast enough internet. So it was very slow taking off. But in 2000, he started a company called Mad Dash. Matt, David, and Shannon put it together, called Mad Dash. That's my email address, by the way. I was a helper with them at one point. And Mad Dash has been very successful. What they do is they create content. What is the content they create? They create content that when you're trying to, as an example, if you want to hire nurses or you want to hire doctors, you want to hire a certain type of scientists, you go on the internet and you post your jobs. What Mad Dash does is they go into that company and they do an all about us, what that company's about. So one of their biggest clients seem to be biotechnology companies here in the Boston area. Makes sense. And they will go down to film them in their elaborate facilities, the Charles River, the Boston area, interview people, interview management, interview employees. What about us? In a 2-minute video. And then they create that, they edit it, they do the writing of it, they edit it, and then they host it, stream it, and hot link it to the client's career site. So if you go into a career on a site for a company in the UK and say, I'm interested in a career in whatever, and you go into the career tab, you say, here's a job. What's that job about? You click on it and you see what the company's about, and you get a 2-minute overview. So he started that company in 2000, 2000 he started it. So it's 20 years old. So I look at these kids and I say, wow, it's okay. They turned out good, and that's my legacy, and I'm proud of them.